Hey everyone, I am Dr. Aaron Wheeler,
And I'm Dr. Matt Cook.
and this is Missio Pop, a podcast on popular missiology where two overeducated white dudes talk about all things in the culture of missions and God's hope for the world.
This first season, we're focusing on the task of contextualization, the way in which culture shapes and forms the way we share God's truth. We're so glad you're here.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Missio Pop. Matt Cook, how are you doing today?
Man, I'm doing great. Super excited about this episode.
Yes, this is an exciting one. We are going off trajectory a little bit here. Matt and I are not going to be, diving deep into some concept or idea within the world of contextualization. Instead, we've brought somebody much smarter, more experienced, better looking than us to have a voice in this place. So let me set this up a little bit.
I can see the listeners it's tripling and quadrupling as you say this. We're not talking and we have somebody else coming in.
Yeah, this is our moment, Matt. This is a big deal.
I can see they're up to 15 now.
Right. We've got more than my parents. We've even got some cousins brought in. So this is a real big deal. When Matt and I were sketching through this season on contextualization, we knew we needed to bring in some other voices. And literally the first person we both were like, we have to talk to this guy, is one of my professors from my days doing an MA in intercultural studies at Wheaton College, Dr. Scott Moreau. He has been an educator at Wheaton College for over 30 years. He is currently serving as the dean of the graduate school. In his time as a thinker and leader in the world of missiology, he has authored or edited more than 20 books, more than 300 articles, and is just an overall great guy. So, Dr. Scott Moreau, welcome. We're glad to have you.
So glad to be here with you, and I'm glad earlier you mentioned how good looking I am, because I think that's the most important thing.
It clearly is. It's what let's be honest, it's what draws the students in. We know how that we're all academics. We know how this game is played.
That's right. The three of us have faces that are fit for podcasts. So this is wonderful.
Yeah, that's why we have no video format. You won't find us on YouTube. We don't play that game. We know how this goes. We accept reality for what it is. So Scott, let's Matt and I both know who you are. I had the joy and privilege of having you in class. I guess this is the time to bring this part up, which is that going back to the early 2010s when I was enrolled at Wheaton in the MA program. My origin story with you is that the organization that I worked for had a free master's program. If you joined into our long-term service, you could do a master's program completely free. And so it was one of those situations where you'd be an idiot to pass this up. And they gave us three choices. We could do educational leadership, we could do TESOL, or we could do intercultural studies. I only sort of knew what that word meant. And it was the closest thing to theology, which is what I really wanted to study. And so I walked into that program not really caring much about the greater world of missiology, not really knowing what these things are. But I ran into you and to your courses in contextualization and intercultural communication. I got the privilege of Dr. Rob Gallagher as well. And how I frame it up is that period of time, those 3 years, I had you in my head, I had Rob in my heart, and I lived in this world of Asia trying to figure out how to do life in ministry, and my entire trajectory was changed. And so
that's cool.
I just want you to know the impact you've had on me, and both in your teachings and in your writings, which I have referenced many, many times in my world since then. Thank you for what you do, and thank you for being here with us.
Oh, praise God.
So as shocking as it may be to me and to others, there may be people who don't actually know who you are. So give us a brief introduction for both of our listeners about your career in missions and in academia.
It's not shocking to me at all that a lot of people don't know me. Quite frankly, I think I enjoy that in any event. My career in missions, when I graduated in 1977, yes, that's a long time ago. I first went over to Swaziland, which is now called Eswatini, which is a tiny little country about the size of New Jersey, located in between South Africa and Mozambique. And I spent 2 years there. My undergraduate degree was in physics, so I taught physics to high school students in Swaziland, and then heard about this seminary that was being started in Kenya. And all my yes bells started ringing at the same time. And so I chose then, after 2.5 years in Eswatini, to head back to the United States to Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, where I did my MDiv. And I went there not knowing that there was a curriculum around a field called missiology. I had not heard of it before. So like you coming into my classes, this is, what does intercultural studies mean? And the word intercultural studies and missiology can be used interchangeably, depending on where you are in the world and which term is more appropriate.
Right.
But missiology is the study of missions. And every time I looked at the electives that were offered that semester, because of the bruising I had received after 2.5 years of living in another culture, it was the courses about crossing cultures that really piqued my interest more than the courses in theology. So, Aaron, I went in less interested in theology, but knowing I needed to go on for some form of a doctorate if I was going to teach in a seminary back in Africa. And you might almost say I accidentally went into the field of missiology. But that was just because those courses looked the most interesting. I wasn't splitting hairs over theological issues. I wasn't worried about memorizing terms like superlapsarianism and infralapsarianism. I didn't have to worry about some of those. I had my own set of big words that I eventually came into, and contextualization is one of those. But that gave me a framing then when I went back to Kenya, this time to teach in a seminary. We taught master's students. All of this was while I was on staff with Cru. So I spent 14 years with Cru. And then my wife, Emily, and I realized it was time. We sensed God calling us to come back to the U.S. And just by a series of sheer coincidences, I wound up at Wheaton on a 1-year temporary teaching position that spun into 32 years. And now I'm retiring. By the time you hear this podcast, I will be very close to retiring. As we recorded, I'm 57 days away from it. And if you were wondering whether I'm counting, that does answer the question for you right away. So coming to Wheaton, my focus has been on graduate school the whole time, and on thinking, writing, teaching. I love all three of those things. Meetings I could happily live without the rest of my life. And as I'm
and grading too. Throw the grading out the window too, right?
Right. Yeah, grading. I eventually discovered that when the papers are stapled together, if I stop up on the 5th floor and drop them from the stairwell in the 5th floor, the papers that go the farthest tend to get the best grades. So, I told students occasionally staple all 4 corners of your paper, and it's more likely to fall further. But a lot of teachers are like me. We love to teach. We're amazed we get paid to teach.
Yeah.
But you cannot pay us enough to grade.
Yeah.
That's just the reality. So
yeah, it's the poison in the soup. It just is what it is.
Yeah, I usually grade with a vast supply of chocolate nearby, which helps me get through the grading. I'll grade a paper and I'll reward myself. I won't tell you how big the chocolate bar is, but I will reward myself. So anyway, that's and being here, this word contextualization was a reasonably new word among people like me in the field of missiology. As a matter of fact, it was coined in 1972. So it wasn't, the word itself is just had its 50th birthday. So it's relatively speaking a new word, but it frames the idea well. You hear it outside of our discipline as well too, but putting things in their context is the basic idea. And so when I think of contextualization, what should a church look like in Kenya? What should a church look like in Swaziland? What should a church look like, Aaron, in East Asia? What should a church look like everywhere in the world? And the reciprocal question eventually is, what should a church look like in the United States?
Yeah.
So, that's been my thinking all along. And having a scientific background, I tended to drift more towards the social sciences than theology, but there's such a massive theological justification for being contextual about our faith,
Yeah.
that never really was a question for me.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's what Matt and I have talked about multiple times, is that contextualization is incarnation. It's the model of Christ.
Right.
He was the ultimate example and portrayer of contextualization. And so if we're not bringing in that theological backing for it, we're deeply missing the point. So I have a question. It's not, I'll spill the beans here. We gave you some questions ahead of time so you could think through these things. I've been on the other side of interviews, and I know how terrible it is when people just drop stuff in your lap. But what you had said historically that brings up a question in my mind is, Matt and I have talked about, we go back to the, 18th, 19th century of some of the history of missions, that it was clear that in that era, contextualization wasn't happening much at all. It was just kind of a copy and paste of how we do church to how we're going to do church here. Where, and then it becomes a term in the 1970s. So clearly it was happening before we created a word around it. Where do you think that shifted? Where do you think that began to happen? What caused people to say, you know what, we can't just copy and paste. We can't just take what we have and put it here.
I would say, in terms of the modern understanding of the term, some parts of the church came to that realization far sooner than other parts of the church did. And by and large, if I were to say there's a principle, is the more conservative people were theologically, the less likely they were willing to contextualize. Because it tended to threaten them to think, wait a second, my theology might need to adjust itself in some way, just because I'm in a new place. And that's a false way of looking at it. But even in the 1800s, we had this term indigenization that was used, and it talked about churches that can financially support themselves, churches that have internal leadership rather than external leadership, say, of the missionaries, and churches that were communicating the message of Christ themselves without having to have the missionary do it for them. Now, this is also the days of colonialism, and that writ large is a lot of what happened around the world. But I would say this, the missions movement of the 18 and early 1900s was successful in ways they didn't anticipate. One thing that happened is when people got a translation of the Bible in their own language and they were able to read it, they started to see incongruities with what the missionary was teaching them and what they read in the text. And a longer a group had its own Bible, the more likely you were to get churches that were being formed apart from the mission world. And despite the rightful criticisms of the colonial era, the global church that we see today is a result of colonial mission efforts, and we can't ignore that. And there have been problems, challenges, consequences, but at the same time, I can't imagine a more exciting era to live, because we're seeing a global church that is not just global, but it's mobile, it's energized, it cares, it's passionate, it doesn't consider itself persecuted if somebody tells a joke about it. It's not running and hiding in a corner. Neither is it turning towards, dare I say it, a form of Christian nationalism that demands that their own country be declared as Christian come hell or high water. And apologies for that language, but there are elements I see that are wonderfully and sometimes frustratingly exciting to me.
I'm glad you brought that up, because there's so much, I find, at least in the American evangelical world, in a similar path like you, spending time in a different country, in a different place, then coming back and trying to fit back in. there's a lot of doom and gloom. There's a lot of question, is this the darkest day of American Christianity? You look at the statistics, you look at the projections of those things, what Pew Research says is going to happen next. And it's like, for whatever that is and wherever that's going to go, guys, get your head above what's just in front of us and just what's happening in this country. What God is doing around the world is crazy.
It's phenomenal.
If we can keep our eyes there, it'll keep us from that discouragement.
I think it's significant that you mentioned the colonial era. The very fact that they were doing translation means they were doing contextualization.
Exactly.
Right? We knock the colonial era, but man, they were busting tail in ways that we can't imagine to learn these languages and then to translate, which was contextualization. So I think that's a great point, that where we're at today is a result of the hard work, though far from perfect, that was done then. I think my biggest takeaway so far is that it's very comforting for me to know that someone at your level still rewards themselves with chocolate when they grade papers. I literally 2 hours ago went and got myself a Diet Cherry Coke to reward myself for grading papers. So I feel great about myself that I'm not the only one who rewards myself. You've hinted at this, especially referring back to the colonial era, but what are some great examples of contextualization that you've been able to witness? What are your favorite things that you've seen as missionaries have contextualized? What's your favorite examples of it?
You don't have to bring up the project that my group created 15 years ago. That we can just take that off the table right now. But
did you do a project? I'm trying to remember right
now.
Yeah,
we did a project. Kat Brandt, Jonathan Wu. We created a project because you required us to do it as kind of our last thing in the course, and that actually became my PhD dissertation. It was taking that project that we did a few different versions of later, and then going and doing qualitative research in country with people who had come to faith through it. So the project we created for your course was the dissertation that I did 300 plus pages of qualitative research on. That became my life for the next decade.
Yes. I've often said a dissertation is the closest a male can come to having a baby. There's not physical pain with it, but there is certainly emotional pain and anguish. So
that one's not what we're talking about, though. Great examples of contextualization.
When I think of examples of contextualization, it's funny when you ask that, because everything I see is contextualization. It doesn't feel that way to me when I go to my church, because that's the water I have swum in, am swimming, whatever the right way the word goes. That's the water I inhabited a good part of my adult Christian life. And so when I go to my church, I don't think about being in an air-conditioned environment in summer and a heated environment where I don't think about sitting in nice padded chairs. I don't think about having an order of service that follows certain steps. I always know we'll open with prayer. We'll have 3 songs because it's a good Trinitarian number. We will, we'll have a welcome, we'll have announcements, we'll have some type of opportunity for giving, we'll have a pastoral prayer, we'll have a sermon, we'll have a closing song, we'll have a benediction. All that stuff is the stuff of contextualization, and that's not a pattern found in the New Testament. It just isn't. And so it's hard for me to say what my favorite example is. If you ask me what the strangest example is, then I can begin to talk about that. It's some African Christians marching up and down a street praising God, but dressed in, most of them in white robes, and some of them are in robes that are a different color. And when I asked a friend, what's the color mean? He said, oh, the color shows what angel appeared to them in a dream and promised to protect them. Now, you might say that's not contextualization, that's heresy. And, there's a lot of nuancing that needs to be done to look at examples like that. But it's the type of thing that I look at and it just throws me for a big loop. So it's strange to me. And I fear my tendency is to say, because it's strange, it must be wrong.
Right.
Rather than saying, okay, in light of scripture, now I'm not going to justify people wearing a colored robe that shows which angel spoke to them. But when I look in the book of Acts, we see appearances of angels. We see dreams, we see visions. And Aaron, as I said in class many times, my Wheaton College conservative evangelical world doesn't have space for things like that, which are thoroughly biblical. And I may, not me personally, people may have written them out because of theological paradigms. God doesn't reveal himself anymore, which I think puts God in a type of lockbox that he doesn't appreciate and he's not going to stay in. But that also doesn't mean we're opening up the Bible for new revelation. Revelation that takes place now is different qualitatively from that which took place through the apostles of the New Testament. And I know we're going so far afield right now, we can go 1,000 directions with this, but that we're speaking in English is contextualization.
Right.
So, and I've only named one example so far, but there are plenty of others that I could easily name. A group I'm working with who was birthed out of kind of a theological marriage of navigators and the Southern Presbyterian Church, but the marriage took place in Korea. So this is a Korean mission group of roughly 1,800 missionaries serving in 100 countries. They're one of the largest Korean mission sending agencies. The vast bulk of them are tent makers, and they are convinced that is how we should raise our support, rather than asking people to support us or relying on faith mission support. And I've loved working with them over the last 25 years because it's like they're holding a mirror up to me, and they are making uniquely and wonderfully Korean mistakes, which illuminate my American mistakes to me, in ways that they choose. If you want to be a leader in that group, you have to act Korean, even if you're not a Korean.
Yeah.
Well, how about the American groups I worked with? You have to act American before you be chosen as a leader, even if you're not American. So that's the type of thing I'm talking about.
That is fascinating. That is fascinating stuff. I mean, I've wondered always in the back of my head one day, like, I have taken contextualization to a certain place and, see examples of it, but like to see other cultures contextualizing for other cultures, like what you're talking about, that's the next level that I haven't been able to dive into. And I wish I could. So that's fascinating. I hadn't thought about the fact that their mistakes illuminate ours.
And contextualization is not a white man's burden, if I can use that terminology.
Absolutely.
And these days, with the gospel going from everywhere to everywhere, it's an unimaginably fertile field for seeing contextualization in process. Look at the immigrant churches here in the United States, the diaspora churches, and how often do they feel strange to white suburban evangelicals like me, only because I don't understand what they're doing or how they're going about doing it, especially if they're not speaking English. But
Right. Yeah. I've had a couple of instances when I was living in Southern California to be a part of Korean churches and Chinese churches. And we're in a different world there. We're looking at a different thing. It's fascinating stuff.
It absolutely is. And like I said, it made me think about leadership, how we tend to unconsciously find leaders who can act like us, even when they're not like us on the inside.
Yeah.
And we think this is what a leader is. And the tendency is we reproduce ourselves through those we choose to become leaders in our own organizations. That's hard. That's just hard.
Man. We could go on that all day. What are some examples of where you've seen, and you don't have to name specific groups or people, but where contextualization has gone wrong, where people have maybe had a good heart, a good intention behind this, and it just doesn't happen?
Well, I'll tell you, probably the most vigorous area of debate among missiologists right now is in the Muslim world,
Hmm.
and is over something called insider movements,
Okay.
where people are, in the name of contextualization, and that's not a judgmental phrase that I'm using. That's just it's a what we call a phenomenological phrase. It's what they're doing, and they're trying to find ways to allow Muslims to stay in their social settings while being lovers of Christ. Now, and there are huge battlegrounds being raised over this, because some fear, and I think in some senses rightly so, if they look Muslim, they think Muslim, they talk Muslim, but they love Jesus, what? How can we even have that? And others are saying, no, this is one of the, dare I use a term from missiology in the 1950s, this is a bridge of God that enables people to cross over into the world. But wait, they're going to mosque.
Right.
But wait, they're taking their shoes off. They're washing their hands. They're bowing maybe towards Jerusalem instead of towards Mecca, but they're doing things that look and feel very Muslim. So this is, when I say as an example of something going wrong, I'm highlighting the battlegrounds rather than delivering a final judgment on that. But one of my concerns is, to the extent that Muslims that follow the insider movement approach, to the extent that they never connect with the larger body of Christ, they are depriving themselves in significant ways of 2,000 years of history, 2,000 years of challenges, 2,000 years of reflection. And I'm not in favor of any community abandoning the larger history with all of its problems of the church.
Yeah. I mean, it makes me think of our own like American version of that. I was talking with a friend just at lunch yesterday, a guy who recently started a new career. And so he's working with a new group of people. And he said he was shocked at how many young American families that he works with, where he interacts with people that are Christian people. They love Jesus. They claim that he's the center of their life. They're involved in spiritual rhythms and disciplines, and they are not connected to any church at any level. Yeah. And it's like, are we talking about the same thing here? Kind of. I mean, it's not, we're not dealing with persecution and the area of that.
There's not fear of death, but there is a complete dissatisfaction with the way the local church has expressed itself to them. And they're not about to, I see this in my own kids at times. So I understand that feeling of seeing it and saying, okay, how healthy is this? If this is a halfway house, that's one thing. If this is what you're deciding is your permanent solution, that's a completely different set of questions with different challenges.
Yeah, that's a great example. I think that whole dilemma, I like to throw that out to my undergrad students, and they're not ready for those sorts of dilemmas yet. It's fun to throw that at them and let them wrestle with it and see where they go with it. And usually they err on the side of traditionalism instead of syncretism, but at least it's helping them to think and wrestle with what it looks like to be a follower of Jesus in culture, which is what this whole conversation is about.
Exactly.
So I hope that at some point, I hope there's some future missionaries listening to this podcast. So what general advice would you give to a missionary who is either in the process of crossing cultures, they're doing it right now and wants to contextualize, or somebody who's planning in the future? So just what's your general advice to them?
If there's a rule of thumb, I would say I want people to understand it's that the gospel is not naked. It comes in flesh in language. It comes in flesh in rituals. It comes in flesh in stories we tell each other. It comes in flesh in doctrines. And as you're hearing, Aaron, I know you're recognizing the 7 dimensions I talk about of contextualization. And I want us to think more holistically than we've been able to think. So number one, the gospel is not naked. It's always infleshed. Number two, I would say the infleshing of the gospel is a culturally valued thing. That doesn't mean the gospel is cultural, but how I communicate it to you and you communicate it to me is infleshed in culture. And so if I ignore that, I'm ignoring the reality that the equipment I received in my training, wherever that may have been, and now I go to a new location, my training, to the extent it has not prepared me for that new set of cultural enfleshments, needs to be almost jettisoned. I want to be careful saying that. Yeah. But it needs to be at least set aside. It can bring wonderful highlights into a new culture of things that might need to be addressed, but it can also bring impediments in which my goal becomes, I want to make people be like me. You know, and we can quote with Paul, imitate me as I imitate Christ himself. But I imitate me as a white male American who just turned 68 years old, and you will be imitating Christ himself. I hope I'm not so arrogant as to say that, but sometimes that's the hidden message, and I want to make those types of things conscious. And that's why I fear too often, even in our own mission agencies, people say, what should I study? Oh, study the Bible. Because the assumption is if I really, really know the Bible and know doctrine and know theology, everything else just will fall into place.
Right.
I guarantee you it won't. And the problem is the more rigid you have become, and I believe in doctrinal statements here at Wheaton. I sign one every year. I have no problem with those types of vehicles, but even Wheaton revised its statement back in the early 90s. We're always thinking, what are the things that we need to do? And they're talking about revising the statement again in the next year or two. Mm-hmm. So and it's not that Wheaton's theology is changing in some respect, but Wheaton's theology is addressing questions that didn't exist in the early 1990s. Gender dysphoria, for example. Yeah. The legalization of marijuana, for example, in the state that Wheaton is part of. Those were questions that were not even on the table at that point in time because cultures change. So if I were to ask somebody, what are you thinking about, or, enfleshment of the gospel is what contextualization is all about, because it's making conscious the things that we do unconsciously, because we do that. Yeah. We enflesh the gospel. We can't stop ourselves. I feel like I'm preaching now, and I'm sorry, but it's all your fault, Matt. You got me on a roll by asking an interesting question to an academic. So, I apologize for that. But
yeah, but I think you hit it on the head that so much of, especially when we're talking about our own culture that we came from, that we feel comfortable in, that the way we do things, especially when it comes to church, the way we do things is just the right way to do things. We don't realize that all of those things are a choice. We don't have to do any of this way. We don't have to have any of these traditions. Like there's not a rule that we get in scripture of this is how to set up your Sunday mornings, let alone even if they're supposed to be on Sunday mornings. That everything is a choice, and we just assume this is the correct way to do it because it's the way it's been done, and we're no longer choosing, we're just doing. And that gets us to a dangerous place. And I think we don't recognize that. There's a way in which we think contextualization is just for missionaries, it's just for crossing national borders, it's just for these defined categories of difference, that when we apply it to our own situation, we don't realize it's the same game. One of the things that I experienced, in your courses, my first, dipping my toes into the world of missiology and hearing these mission strategies. I wasn't a missions major in my undergrad, so this is my first step into this. And I remember feeling this level of frustration of like, this stuff isn't for missionaries. I grew up I'm a preacher's kid, I'm a preacher's grandkid, I'm a preacher's nephew. Like this was my world, was domestic church ministry. And I'm thinking, this is stuff that ministers need to be trained on. This is stuff that, you can never go 5 miles away from your hometown and you're going to deal with this stuff. that these are the, missiology has all these jewels that we need to share with the rest of ministry, because
Yeah.
it's all dealing with the same stuff.
Well, I mentioned that we used your contextualizing the faith in my graduate course, contextualization. I think one of the 12 students is planning on being a cross-cultural missionary, but it was so incredible for them to glean from, glean, that's not a very contextualized word, is it?
It's okay.
To gain from your book and just the whole world of contextualization, and then take it immediately this week into their ministries right here in the United States, because that's something they've missed out. They take the class because they have to have one missions class through their, one or two missions classes through their course of studies. And what they think is, okay, I'm going to check the box off, knock this class out. But man, you take a class on contextualization, and all of a sudden you've got some serious tools that you can use right now in ministry in the United States.
And the challenge for that, I feel like, is more challenging than ever. I think of, I had a student in my grad program this semester that he just got promoted to lead pastor. And so he's the guy who has to stand up and preach every Sunday morning. And he knows that in the pulpits, or in the pews, he's got 5 different generations represented. That's a new thing now that, our healthcare system is whatever it is and people are getting older. You've got a more diverse audience than ever. And it's like, how do you preach Acts 10 to 5 different generations? That's a new level of challenge.
Very carefully.
Today's sponsor is Ozark Christian College, one of my favorite places in the world. Not only did I have a transformational experience as a student there myself, but now I'm kind of in the business of trying to make that happen for others, serving on its faculty. And today I want to talk to you about the Master of Arts in Biblical Ministry with a spiritual formation concentration. This degree is specifically for those who have a calling to learn how to lead people into healing and wholeness in Jesus. What this degree is all about is giving a deep dive into God's Word and learning how to partner with the Holy Spirit to experience internal change that will lead to external change of the world. If this is something you're interested in, I highly encourage you to learn more and apply for free at occ.edu/masters.
How are things going? I mean, really going for your church post-COVID? At Kindred Exchange, we hope your congregation is thriving, that your people are connected to each other, your community is connected to your people, and all of these people are reaching the world with overflowing love and gospel impact. We have a hunch, though, because we are also a part of churches, that perhaps things are a bit messier than this. Over the last decade, we experienced new critiques to evangelism and American Christianity in a plurality of ways. Then, a global pandemic cultivated a natural break for many to step away from the faith community they had always known. We want to be a part of what's next for you. With the Mission Audit Weekend at Kindred Exchange, you'll gather with leaders from area churches to ask the tough questions about what's past, what's next, and what's best for the gospel to be an encouragement not only to your immediate neighbors, but to your neighbors across the globe. Through keynotes, facilitated workshops, and curated moments of networking and sharing, our team of mission experts will guide your church leadership through a 2-day assessment of your outreach programs and strategies. It's no secret that people are hungry for good news. Let's make sure we're using relevant approaches to help that good news be received as hope and light in a heavy, fast-changing world. If your church would like to be a city host, let us know. Or you can sign up for our next event taking place in Nashville on August 25th and 26th at www.kindredexchange.org/audits.
When I was in Africa, my last few years, I started thinking about how do you contextualize preaching? Because most, and the rule of thumb I've always had is that the more pragmatic something it is, the harder it is to contextualize.
Sure.
Because it's the atmosphere you breathe, it's the water you're swimming in. And I realized, okay, how did Africans traditionally get across truth. Before the Bible ever came, they told stories.
Mm-hmm.
And it's fascinating to see how many African stories the main character dies. You don't see that in American fairy tales. The main character beats up the bad guy and lives happily ever after, and and getting married in the process. But for them, life was so harsh that they had to have main characters who blew it and died as a result. So and it was understanding having a better understanding of a worldview. And there's no such thing as a single African worldview. But I realized they would tell a story and have a central point. And then they would tell another story and another story, all focused on the central point. And it's almost like the shape of a daisy.
Yeah.
And the smaller ones maybe were the more important ones. And the larger petals were big and beautiful, and they told great stories. But they might, it all depends. I'm carrying the metaphor way too far here. But, I think the biggest compliment I ever received was an African pastor coming up to me at the church where I was attending with my family. And he said, "Why is it that you preach like an African and I preach like an American?" Well, he had been trained at an American seminary. So he was always 3 points, 3 P's, ending with ing for his sermon. And I realized, okay, even where you get your education moderates things in unintended ways.
Preaching's a tough one. That I remember the first time I came across the Daisy method of preaching, and that was fascinating. I've heard one recently. I don't know who brought this up or where this came from, but they've talked about in modern preaching styles, especially in the US, you're dealing with attention spans. And how much, over 25, 35 minutes, someone is paying attention to anything that you're saying. And said the way that he's approached preaching now is a bit like a boxer in a boxing match. I'm going to I'm not going to have 3 points that sequentially, logically step from one to the other. Instead, like a good boxer, I'm going to throw 8, 10, 12 punches at you and just pray one of them lands. And that's going to be
I thought you were going to say, no, I have a 3-minute sermon. I take a little break, and then I have another 3-minute sermon. Through 10 rounds with you rather than 10 punches.
Yeah. But that's kind of what you're saying, is like under the topic of, whatever text or whatever topic we're working with, I'm going to hit this thing 8 to 10 different ways and just hope one of them lands and one of them gets you, because over this 30 minutes, I can't assume any kind of attention. And it's just it's almost like a shotgun, buckshot style preaching.
Right. You're helping me make some connections. Jay Moon called this a digitoral world. It's digital, but it's oral rather than
I haven't heard that.
A pure literate word. Yeah. And he does a good job with that in a book called Cross-Cultural Discipleship, where he helps me understand where this generation is coming from. And I'm thinking when we do web courses, and I've been teaching online for years now. Aaron, you were here before Wheaton really got into that. And
no, we had none of that.
Yeah, but we're always told, no, keep your lecture videos 7 minutes or less. Because you go longer than that, and the fast forward button start. When people track this, what the students are doing, they're going through the fast forward button. And so even if you've got 2 hours worth of lectures, it's going to be 20 tapes, not tapes, 20 videos. And people will take a break in between. But the way you said that made me think, okay, is that how we need to approach the sermon? You do 3 minutes.
I did back in the fall. It was just I like a good intuitive or deductive. And I like a good inductive sermon that leads me to one big idea. I mean, that's, Andy Stanley, the whole deal. But I had this little series where I needed to do have 3 points. And I just couldn't bring myself to do 3 points in a poem. So I thought, I'm going to break these up into 3 10-minute deals, and let's sing a song or two between each thing. Man, you would have thought that they loved it. And I remember when we came the next Sunday when the series was over and I had to preach a normal sermon, I got up and apologized. It's like, I'm sorry, guys. Like my kids were like, Dad, we love these 10-minute sermons. So maybe there's I just did it because of the circumstances, but maybe there's something to this and contextualization.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of my
Exactly.
soapboxes that I've been on is in our chapels here on campus, that we have the second sermon, which is when the worship leader, after the sermon is over, gives their own mini 3-minute sermon, in which, I've always said, guys, we just got a sermon. We don't need another one. But maybe actually this is what we should be doing. And maybe we should lean harder into that. Maybe I need to stop getting on my soapboxes. But this kind of brings us
The
into.
first time I preached in Bulgaria, with a translator, and I preached the sermon, and I sat down next to a person who was a missionary there and had been there 15 years, and his Bulgarian was very good. And the pastor said something. He said, "Oh, the pastor just paid you a huge compliment." I said, "What's that?" He said, "I have nothing more to say."
Oh.
And it's always when pastors have a guest speaker and they don't like what the guest speaker says, then they will preach a sermon to fix what was just said. And I thought, whoa, I had no idea.
They can even preach the sermon in a prayer. They can pull that off. That's when you really.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you think something as simple as breaking up the sermon into bite-sized chunks, and with this next generation, that might not help the people of my age, but you know what? It's still different enough. It will engage my interest if you broke it up into 7-8 minute chunks and had a song or a prayer or an activity that people were doing, or turned your neighbor, as exciting as that can be for introverts like me in church, and talk about what the pastor just said. Or sometimes just it's a 1-minute prayer. God, what are you saying to me through this point? But you're breaking it up, and it feels different. So, and that's contextualization is not doing that. It's consciously doing that in light of your audience. So in an audience, if you're going to an old folks home, for example, and you try and do that, they won't get it in the same way as if you're preaching it that way at your church. And that's what contextualization asks. So
I just want to bring up that so the future of preaching may have just been discovered out of a Church of Christ in Western Tennessee. Can we just acknowledge that just happened? That who knew that the cutting edge of the latest and greatest in the world of preaching came out of that source?
But the key though is to mirror what we did. It has to be an a cappella song between each of the three.
Or else, if you use instruments, then you lose the moment.
Right. Now, that was, as you were talking about that, Scott, that reminded me of a church in your area called the Practice Church, that is deep into spiritual disciplines and rhythms as part of their ecclesiology, really. And I've heard a few of they just put their services up as a podcast. It's nothing fancy. They just literally record it, put it. And I've noticed that their preacher will do that. He'll have these long times of silence, of kind of some rhythms of examine in the midst of the sermon, as a way to kind of say, we just talked about this, we just learned this, we just thought about this. Let's give us some space. Let's stop and let me ask some good questions and just let you engage with the Holy Spirit and see what happens. And as I've just listened to these in podcast form, it's really been impressive of the way things are different when you just are willing to add new elements.
And so what we're saying here is contextualization is not just over there. It's here, but it's harder for us to see it here, unless, for example, we've lived there or somewhere outside of our current here for a long enough time for this to feel a little bit strange to us. Or maybe very strange to us. But it's the stranger who can look at things and say, help me understand. And when my kids would ask me questions, and kids are great at asking questions, and they got to the stage where when they were asking the why questions, I finally had to say, because that's just the way it is. I knew I was hitting a contextualization bumping point. And occasionally I would say, because I'm the dad and you're not, or because I
said so.
Because I said so, But they're hitting at things that if I had known the answer to it, still wouldn't have satisfied them, but it simply told me, okay, this is not part of my conscious thinking about my own culture, my own ideals, my own values.
Well, that kind
I
of
don't want
brings
to be
us
reading.
to where I wanted this conversation to go, which is, when you think of contextualization and the discipline of it, what do you have to say to the larger American church? I mean, we are all in the, evangelical world. What role do you think contextualization has played? What, in the twin demons of traditionalism and syncretism, where have you seen that wreak havoc? What would you say to us and to our own kind of people in this area?
I'll start with a preface by saying I wish I had a red light going off in my forehead every time something moved into syncretism.
Mm.
But that's where the body becomes very important, the body of Christ, to help us. What does the history of the church say about this? Because for the most part, we might have some new things. And again, I'll use this example, such as gender dysphoria, that the first century church didn't face in the way we do today. Screen time is something that the first century church didn't face in the way we do. Divided attention span is something they didn't face. So those are new, but I'm hard pressed to find any way that we can simply ignore that what we are putting together is a contextual thing. And that to our detriment in the long run.
What would you say we're putting together? What does that mean?
Church service.
But in what way?
Building projects.
Okay.
Baptismal rituals. And I'm not meaning to step on theological toes with that. A small group Bible study. Most of the theologizing in our churches today is not done by people reading books. It's by people listening to a sermon or a podcast. And we call that oral theology, singing hymns or singing Hillsong or singing other contemporary Christian styles of music, whether it's a cappella or with instruments. Those are all part of the rhythms that we follow that are enfleshed rhythms. And so, Matt, going to your church, I might have a challenge, especially if I was supposed to lead and start us in the right key for an a cappella hymn or contemporary song or whatever it would happen to be. But I could understand it and feel it. It's when I lived in Swaziland and everybody on either side of me was singing in a part. And I have enough trouble with a melody, let alone people who sing in harmony. I never met a Swazi who was tone deaf. And I'm tone impaired. I'm not completely tone deaf. But that was a challenge for me. So what I would say to the American church today is you already are contextualizing. Become conscious of it. And that opens the door to asking questions. Is this the best way to reach the audience I have in my church, to minister to them, to equip them for works of service, as Paul mentions in Ephesians, to offer help for their hurts, to offer exhortation for their not doing things they should be doing? Is this the best way to do it? And I think if we're thinking contextually, then it opens the doors to finding new ways rather than unconsciously simply doing it the way we've always done. So Matt, you talked about, changing the sermon. And there's a part of me that says, okay, I'm so glad that you apologized to your congregation after you finished the sermons. But why? Why didn't you just keep doing that the same? And I'm not meaning to push you right now. I'm just saying, if it's part of your conscious thought processes, okay, how can I bring this into the normal church life? Yeah,
that's right. That's a great point. So, Aaron, I know we're kind of running low on time. I want to get to these. We could do this all day long, but I want to get to these fun questions here at the end. So you've written a lot. I'm thankful that it's fun to interview and talk. I'm gonna go brag about this later to my colleagues. So like I got books on my bookshelf with the guy's name that I talked to earlier today. What did you do? So my day was cooler than everybody else's. So of all the books that you've written, or contributed to, anything
Edited.
goes.
Yeah,
Which one's your favorite?
I would say Contextualizing the Faith is my favorite, because it is more than any other book. It is who I am, and it's what I believe needs to be done. Yeah, that's my favorite. And it's not always that your newest book is your most favorite, but in this case, it really is. So,
well, let's run with that book then. You're most widely known for these 7 dimensions of contextualization. Which one of the 7 do you think is most neglected, and which one's your favorite to think through?
Yeah, I would say the one that's probably most neglected is the artistic. And that ranges from the architecture of our churches. Aaron, you might remember I have a collection of images of Christ painted by people from around the world, and it's over 6,000 images right now, from first century, probably second or third century actually, through 21st century. I've categorized them so they're all by kind of events in the life of Jesus. And I love finding a song by someone who I resonate deeply with their singing, their writing skills. Michael Card is one of those artists. And I love taking that song and putting images with it that I then use for a devotional. But I think evangelicals, and there's a new field called ethnodoxology, and it's how ethnicity plays into worship, and that hits that field. Now, I'm not comfortable with body expressions of faith, like the African churches, dancing and so on. I am fully inhabited in a way that makes me so inhibited I can't meaningfully let go. And I don't think that's going to change in however many years, weeks, or months the Lord gives me to be on the planet. But at the same point in time, the visual art, I'm a strong visual learner, and the visual art is something that most excites me, and I think is least represented in the evangelical world. The one that I think is overdrawn is the theological dimension. And as I said earlier, it's because people tend to think that if they get the theology right, everything else will follow. And so when you're looking at the word contextualization and you Google it, or you get into a database and you look at it, the vast bulk of the literature is contextualizing theology in some way, shape, or form. And too much of today's contemporary contextualization loses the anchor of Scripture and looks at the modern trends or the modern sociological tools and wants to draw on those. I don't think it's wrong to draw on those, but it is if you lose your anchor, which is the biblical text. And so that's where I have a concern with that. But the other one that I would say that is the most challenging one to follow is what I call the supernatural experience dimension. And from tongues to healings to prophecy to dreams to visions, how do we contextualize that stuff? Well, frankly, we don't try and force it, but contextualization for me means dealing with it as it comes up in healthy ways that are based in Scripture and that are rooted in community. So from exorcism, which is not a biblical word, by the way, the biblical word tends to be casting out. So from deliverance to casting out to counseling someone about a dream or a vision to helping someone who wants to speak in tongues but can't, or someone who does speak in tongues and wonders where they're coming from. It's all this kind of stuff that at a place like Wheaton, we're not sure how to deal with. The last thing I wanted, and thankfully I'm leaving Wheaton in a couple of months now, was to be known as the demon guy. at Wheaton. That's not good for academic reputation. That's not good for collegial interaction. But yet I found over the years, if the counseling center has a student that has to deal with something, they tend to send them to me. And they're highly qualified counselors. They're just a part of my job when I deal with students like this is to help them build a better toolkit.
Yep.
You know, and it doesn't have to be a screwdriver to solve this problem. This might require a hammer, or this might require a torch, or this might require, you know, whatever it might happen to be, and to help them normalize it. They're not weird. There's not something wrong with them. They've had an experience. They're trying to figure out what to deal with. And that for me is where I contextualize for them. Africans, I don't have to contextualize in the same way. I don't have to convince them that this is okay or this is wrong. I have to deal with it more forthrightly, shall I say. So even our counseling practices should be contextualized. But that gets into ritual, doesn't it? Oh, isn't that another dimension that we could talk about? So
Yeah, it's funny you bring up being the demon guy, because I thought I was gonna have to break in earlier and say that, you know, as much as I think of you as the contextualization guy, that's the frame and the lens in which I've always viewed you through, is that you've done extensive work on spiritual warfare and that area as well. And I think there's probably a lot of people that's how they think of you. They think of you as the spiritual warfare and, like you said, the demon guy.
hopefully not. But
both of those are definitely part of your work and legacy. And for those who don't know, that's a helpful context. Besides your own book, what if you went to other authors? What if you went outside of things with your name on it? If you were going to recommend a contextualization resource, could be an article, could be a movie. I mean, I don't know. I remember you showing like Japanese anime in one of our courses one time. So I know you have a wide breadth on these things. What's the best contextualization resource you would recommend?
And thank you for giving me an easy escape, because my brain kind of freezes at the question. But there's a movie called Jitensha, Jitensa. And it's actually done by a film crew out of Biola for their film majors. And it's the story of a Japanese man and his bicycle. And what I love about the story is it's very indirect in its communication, which is it takes place in Japan, and so it's very Japanese. But God steals pieces of this bicycle, and this guy said, you know, he writes a letter, "Dear thief, you know, just take the whole thing." And the next day, a letter is taped on it, "Dear," the name of the main character. No, I'm not a thief, I'm God. And it starts kind of this dialogue, and God scatters these pieces and then gives the person a series of addresses to go meet people, because this is a person who's completely isolated himself from others, and he needs people. Now, it's more pre-evangelistic than evangelistic,
right?
But it's so strange for Americans to see it, and it has definite Christian orientations, but it's not quite the Chronicles of Narnia,
right?
You know, and you don't have an Aslan character. God is amorphous and hidden. The bicycle is not God, and the bicycle is not a demon, and the bicycle is not a church building. It's just a stupid bike. But to find the pieces, he needs the help of other people in the neighborhood. So it's that type of thing that I love in contextualization. So Matt, it's maybe a 20-minute video. You should show that as a sermon sometime in your church. Unfortunately, it has a musical score behind it, so there will be instruments, and I don't know how careful you need to be with
What
that.
are the rules on that, Matt?
We're okay with background music and videos. We're okay.
Are you? Okay, I didn't know that.
Okay.
I have one of the great things I've enjoyed.
Just making sure I didn't want to put you on the chopping block by recommending that as a video, but that might be it's a fun video for classes.
Yeah.
And I use that in my intercultural communication class all the time.
Is it? Can we find that on YouTube or where?
Probably on YouTube. Yeah, Jitensha, Jitensha. And yeah, you'll love it.
Okay, no, that's
Cool.
fantastic. Yeah, it's getting about time for us to wrap this up. Dr. Moreau, thank you
Yeah,
thoroughly. It's
thank
been
you
an
a
honor and
ton.
privilege to have you here and to talk through these things. It made me miss, our times together and being able to be in this space more. But we're glad you're here. We're two guys that have, like you, been on these weird journeys of missions, turns into academics, turns into too many degrees and titles. And we get to be involved with students in the next generation. And we hope that, we can walk the road as long as you have. And if we can measure a fraction of the legacy that you have, we'll have done all right. So thank you so much for being here. Thanks for being a
By
part
God's
of.
grace,
Go ahead.
by God's grace, you will your path will be longer.
Well, that would be a blessing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Been great.
Matt, any
Thanks
last
a lot.
words there? Go ahead.
Yeah, man, this just been great. My day's been better than any of my colleagues. It's good stuff.
I'm so glad to give you bragging rights.
Yeah.
I didn't meet a Scott Moreau. I met the Scott Moreau. So
That's
Well,
right.
technically you met both, because then, on
Right.
Amazon it's A. Scott Moreau. So,
it is.
what is A? I have never known. Matt was asking me earlier.
Arthur?
Arthur. Okay.
Yeah,
All right.
sometimes I tease by saying another, but I don't. And if you Google my name, you will probably hit first a Johnny Cash imitator
Okay.
who was in $1 Million Quartet, who happens to have Scott Moreau as his name as well too.
That's funny.
Well, that's
but
fun.
I guarantee you that is not.
Yeah. All right. Well, that wraps up our time for today. We are getting towards the end of the season. This has been a fun, continuing conversation on the world of contextualization in missiology. Thank you guys for listening, and we will see you next time.